Okay, joining me today, I have Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on again.
Sure.
Uh, French President Emmanuel Macron says that sending NATO troops, boots on the ground, is not something that should be removed from the table. We must do everything we can to stop Vladimir Putin. So, this is a top G7 leader saying he's considering sending military troops on the ground into Ukraine. Would this be France leading the way and going first? Would he try to convince all NATO nations to send a coalition? Or is this Macron trying to sound tough on TV?
I would characterize him as an unserious player in all of this. First of all, you've got to understand that he's got nothing to send. The French army is a very light force designed for employment in North Africa. As a friend of mine who's retired from the French army likes to say, the French army is designed for safari in Africa. The British army is even smaller, less capable, and could probably go to Belize and provide emergency relief or put down riots in Belfast, and that's about it. Europe has no forces to speak of. The one single powerful, potent force that Europe had was the German army. And the German army has been almost completely dismantled. It'll take years to recover from the damage done to it over the last 20, 25 years. And then finally, that leaves us. We just cut 24,000 spaces out of the regular army because we couldn't recruit. So we've just cut them. They're now talking as they have in the past. The generals do this repeatedly over time. They never change the force. They never alter it. They never adapt it. They never reorganize fundamentally. What they do is they strip it out. So instead of having 3 battalions in an organization, you go to 2, or instead of 4 companies inside of an organization, you go to 3. In other words, they hollow out the force. To be blunt, NATO is holding a very weak hand and is bluffing. And we're a big part of that because we talk a great game, but we don't have anything to send. That's what you call in poker a dead man's hand. The Russians have a very strong hand. They are not bluffing, and they have not threatened. But what they have done is make very clear that if we attack them, if NATO attacks Russia in any way, shape, or form, then NATO will be at war with Russia. Now, very recently, within the last 24 hours, there are reports coming out that more mobile, long-range ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads have been moved further west, north and west of Belarus, and also to other areas closer to the west. So I think everything has been done that could possibly be done by Moscow to signal they're quite serious. We have never been serious. If we were serious, we wouldn't need a proxy war, would we? We're not serious. So we built our military capability on the backs of the Ukrainian people. That's over. Ukraine is destroyed as a nation. You have this illegitimate, corrupt, and criminal organization in Kiev that calls itself the Ukrainian government. They won't last. Whether they'll be removed by their own or end up being pushed out by the Russians, I don't know. But they're done. And all that is left to be done now from the Russian side is to retake Kharkov, which they will, and then they'll retake control of Odessa, which are historically Russian cities. There is another fly in the ointment at the moment, and that is that Moldova has a government which chose to join NATO without the consent of the governed in Moldova. And now the Transnistrian Republic, which contains 220,000 Russian citizens in the lower southeastern corner of Moldova, it's the Republic of Transnistria, they have asked Russians for assistance because they are living under a blockade right now at Brussels and Washington's assistance. Moldova is trying to essentially make life miserable for the 220,000 Russians that live there. So I imagine when they finally take Odessa, there will be a predisposition to simply march a little further west and north and incorporate Transnistria into what is historically southern Russia down there. Remember the area like where Odessa is, for instance, and all along the Black Sea was until the 1770s Turkish, Tartar, and Mongol. People don't seem to understand that. Ukraine never touched the Black Sea. Ukraine is much further north. So what you have is areas that were formerly Ottoman. Before they were Ottoman, they were Mongolian, Tartar, the Crimean Khanate. Those areas will now become part of Russia too, and you'll end up with the landlocked Ukraine, which is what Ukraine historically was. I think that's where we're headed, unless somebody stands up with some common sense and decides to talk intelligently to the Russians. But lying to everybody and saying that Ukraine can snatch inglorious defeat or a great victory from inglorious defeat is nonsense. There's no chance for that to happen at all.
Yeah. Chuck Schumer said, if we just get them that 60 billion, they'll win. It's such naive thinking. I mean, I'm beyond disappointed in members of the Senate, but to say just giving them the money will make them win is ludicrous.
Well, it's not disappointing. It's the voice of corruption and deceit. These people are liars. The last thing they want to do is stand up and admit to what they've done. They've destroyed Ukraine. He could care less what happens to the Ukrainian people. His friend Zelensky is what he's concerned about, and the interests that Larry Fink and BlackRock and other major corporations with agricultural interests have in Ukraine. That's what concerns him, because right now Zelensky is willing to essentially hold a fire sale and sell off whatever is left of Ukraine to those capitalists in the West that are associated with Senator Schumer and his friends. This is gangsterism. This is not any form of diplomacy or national military strategy that makes sense. And remember, you had Victoria Nuland recently on the talk show circuit telling everybody, well, look, if we give more money to Ukraine, you have to understand most of that money stays here because it buys weapons and technology and capabilities. So this keeps factories humming. And in the meantime, all of that, eventually will get to Ukraine, but not for some period of time. But most of the cash, importantly, is recycled. In other words, it stays in the United States, and large portions of it go to the shareholders in the industries and to some to constituents to pay them for their work. And a lot of it will be recycled into political action committees that keep people like Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer in power. And by the way, the drug cartels, I'm sure, would be very grateful because they're already walking around Mexico with Javelin missile systems on their backs. I'm sure they've got lots of other things thanks to the arms bazaars in places like Kosovo and elsewhere in the Balkans and the Middle East, where these weapons are being recycled and resold for profit, thanks to the Ukrainian gangsters that are running what is left of Ukraine.
Yeah. You've been on Tucker Carlson many times. He was recently on the Lex Friedman podcast. They spoke for almost 3.5 hours. During that time, they talked about his interview with Vladimir Putin. During that Lex Friedman podcast, Tucker Carlson said that if he were president of the United States, that he would get rid of NATO. He said NATO simply exists to enrich the military-industrial complex of Europe and the United States. He said the people of Washington, D.C. are making a fortune off of taxpayers, and NATO does not need to exist. Basically, if there was a world war, we would all come together anyway. So why are we sinking trillions of dollars collectively into an organization that just enriches politicians? What are your thoughts on his comments?
NATO is very unlikely to survive the current crisis in Ukraine. I don't know whether or not the European Union will survive, but certainly NATO its future is very questionable. And I'll explain why. First of all, it's not a question of what we want. What do the Europeans want? The European peoples were happy to be allied with us because there was a real existential threat to them in the aftermath of World War II. Remember that we only did half a job. We advanced to the middle of Germany and stopped. Half of Europe fell into the hands of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. They then built this enormous force which was aimed at us. Now, people will say, but they were really never serious about invading Western Europe. Well, I think that I could make a damn good argument that they were very serious about invading Western Europe, certainly through the 60s. But by the early 70s, I think they were no longer interested in that. They simply wanted to hold on to what was there. And that's essentially what they did. And of course, that bred stagnation and decline, and eventually they simply fell apart on their own. I know everybody wants to believe that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War and defeated the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union defeated itself. NATO is defeating itself. We picked this phony opponent. And I say phony because Russia is really not the opponent. And Putin, contrary to what's been accused, has never been interested in the restoration of the Soviet Union, far from it. He says frequently, anybody who doesn't miss the Soviet Union has no heart, and anybody who wants to bring it back has no brain. You know, it's one of those things that in retrospect, Russians can look back on and say, well, we were powerful then, but they were also poor and miserable and oppressed. So there's no interest in that whatsoever. Unfortunately, for various reasons, we've decided to characterize them in the worst terms and insist that they present this real threat. I think the European peoples are figuring out that's not true. Now, it's taking them longer than it would normally take because they're even more gullible than Americans in terms of believing whatever the mainstream media says. And they're much better at censoring. That means suppressing and oppressing people like you, Stephen, and others who represent alternative sources of information. But the information is getting through. And if you look at the polling data, the Poles, who were quite excited a couple of years ago about destroying Russia, now are in overwhelming numbers opposed to a war with Russia. Yet their government still talks in stupid terms, but the Polish people are not interested in going to war with Russia. And the chiefs of staff of the Polish armed forces have said, are you insane? We're not prepared to fight the Russians. And if I were going to pick the one army in Europe today that's actually pretty good, it's disciplined, it's well organized, it's well trained, its equipment is improving every day, it's the Polish army. It's actually very good, but it's in no shape to take on the Russians. And neither are we. So who are we kidding? We're holding this very weak hand, and we continue to bluff and bluff and bluff. And remember, these are the same people that say, well, don't worry about the economy and don't worry about the financial system. We'll just print more money. You know, it's the same crowd. And the same crowd is now saying, this is great. Look what Israel's doing. Let's send them everything they want. And what are they trying to bring on? Well, whether they realize it or not, they're bringing on a regional war. And the first question that all Americans need to ask is it in our interest to cultivate and unleash a regional war in the Middle East? Is it in our interest to cultivate and unleash a wider war in Eastern Europe? Is it in our interest to provoke the Chinese and unleash a war against China? No, the one thing that's in our interest right now, we know without hesitation, is securing the border and throwing the illegals out and crushing the criminals inside our country, restoring the rule of law. That's what has to be done. That's paramount. The rest of it, absolutely not. We have no interest in it. The American people have no interest in it.
Yeah. But Chuck Schumer says we have to get this money to Ukraine, and then we can deal with the border. Mitch McConnell says we got to get this money to Ukraine, then we can deal with the border. It seems the only person that's standing up for the border is Speaker Mike Johnson, and even he is under tremendous amounts of pressure to keep the government open, keep money flowing to the military-industrial complex. So I don't know how this border gets fixed, and yet Trump is heading to the border tomorrow. Biden's heading to the border. Everyone's showboating as if they're going to do something. Will anything actually happen, though?
Well, what's happened in the past? Nothing. Politicians tend to follow public opinion. They don't lead it. And what you have from time to time is what you're seeing right now. Oh, wait a minute. You better talk about the border. Everybody's really exercised about the border. If you don't do that, we won't get the money we want for all these other things. And so suddenly Biden says, I'm going to go to the border. I'm sure they've got lots of ice cream for him. He'll be very happy. But it won't make a damn bit of difference. And, with all due respect to Mr. Johnson, I don't see him doing anything. I mean, to be frank, everybody is caught up in this trap of self-enrichment and corruption that really runs the machine, the political machine. And until we have a severe economic crisis and a financial collapse of some kind, nothing will change. Now, when it comes to the border, how many times have we listened to people talk to us about the border over the last 25 or 30 years? We've heard it over and over and over again. 110,000 Americans died last year from fentanyl poisoning. And what are we doing about the border? And most of that, not all, but most of it overwhelmingly comes up through the border from Mexico. You'll hear somebody say, oh, let's attack China because some of the ingredients for fentanyl or the fentanyl itself comes from China. Oh, that's a brilliant idea. Let's start another war when we are absolutely incapable of waging an effective regional war as it is, and add more to the national sovereign debt and do more damage to our society while we leave the border open. If you go back and look at the incursion by Pancho Villa in, I think it was 1916, excuse me, it involved the death, I think, of 11 Americans. Not all were military. Some were civilians who came out to help the soldiers fight off Pancho Villa's guerrillas. And then eventually Pancho Villa pulled out. He was trying to sort of rob from the arsenal, frankly, to supply his troops that were engaged in the revolution. But what did Woodrow Wilson do? He put 100,000 National Guardsmen on the border and closed it. He sent 25,000 troops from the regular army into Mexico, not just to chase Pancho Villa, but to drive the chaos, the criminality, the corruption south, away from the American border. And those troops were commanded by General Pershing, who was already at that point in command of the Mexican border, because in those days we had the United States Army on the Mexican border, and for good reason. Mexico had been an unstable place from the time it gained independence from Spain. And we've always had problems down there with illegal trafficking of all sorts of kinds and types, people, drugs, you name it. So talk is cheap, action is everything, and I'm waiting to see real action. And at the moment, I don't see much evidence for it.
I agree with you there. So Admiral Sir Tony Radakin of the United Kingdom Armed Forces, he's the head, I guess, of that division. He says Russia doesn't want a conflict with NATO as it would lose quickly. He said NATO would bottle Russia's Navy up quickly and establish air superiority. My first question is, does Putin even want to continue to take over Europe? I think we've established that that is not true. And then second, would NATO really be able to bottle up the Russian Navy and gain air superiority, or would this just lead us into World War III?
Well, let's talk about the first question. Take a good long look at Europe right now, particularly Western Europe. It's a catastrophe. Great Britain is in serious economic trouble. You know, the reason you've got this man, prime minister, who's lasted as long as he has is because there doesn't appear to be anybody else capable of stepping in and doing anything. They'll probably elect this man Starmer, who's a Labourite, eventually to go in there as a prime minister. But what are they going to do? They're in as bad a situation as we are with regard to indebtedness and drops in productivity and printing money. You know, that's what everybody's been doing. France is in a permanent state of chaos. I'm surprised Macron is still there. Germany, well, Germany looks pacific, but it's got huge problems internally. It's got millions of people that they're stuck with, thanks to Merkel and her predecessors, that are never going to be Germans and are essentially a blight on Germany. They're not a benefit to German society. You know, we could talk about Italy. Italy's got huge problems. No one in their right mind wants those places. Why would Putin, who has a very stable, cohesive society with a very productive economy, he's now the number one economy in Europe. The place that Germany used to have is now occupied by Russia, of all places. Remember Russia, the weak state that we can bully, strip its resources, turn over its government because its people hate Putin, and we'll win, and this will be over quickly. I would put the predictions of this admiral in the same category as self-delusion as this, as were the case as was the case back in January of 2022. First of all, this is a shock, but everybody needs to understand it. Russia is not a maritime power. Russia's only real requirement is to have a submarine force. And that submarine force, whether this admiral has figured it out or not, can sink most of the surface fleet sent against it. All right? We would not in a war be able to reinforce our ground forces on the ground in Europe because the submarines in the Atlantic would sink everything that tried to go between North America and Europe. Remember, the Germans did that. And for 3 years, we fought a very tough battle in the Atlantic before we finally won free passage. And even then, till the very end of the war, we were still dealing with a submarine menace. Submarines today are infinitely more lethal, more capable, and more dangerous than anything that existed 80 years ago. You know, there's a statement that everyone should memorize. It comes out of the United States Navy. It's said privately, but it's true. There are only two classes of ships: submarines and targets. So the good admiral could watch all of his surface ships go under thanks to submarines or land-based missiles. Secondly, Russia is a land power par excellence, just as Germany used to be. You know, you can't defeat these people with air and naval power. Russia has enormous air defenses and can have more. And we have not yet tested NATO aircraft against their air defenses. And one of the reasons we haven't done it is that we're very concerned that we'll be shot down. How many billion-dollar aircraft do we need to lose? Or how many billion-dollar B-2 bombers do we want to risk? How many have we got? The Germans during World War II destroyed 18,000 bombers, British and America, trying to bomb Germany. 18,000. What have we got? And today's missiles and radars and air defenses and space-based surveillance, reconnaissance, infinitely, infinitely better than anything that existed 80 years ago. The good admiral is smoking something. And I don't think it's tobacco. I think he's crazy. So the notion that NATO would quickly win any conflict with Russia is absurd. What you would see is something much worse than anything in Eastern Europe. It would be a grind, and it would last, and it would endure, and Russia would come out on top because its society is cohesive. Its population is behind it, and more important, China will support it. So will Iran. So will many other countries in the world that see Russia as standing up to us, resisting not just our military hegemony, our financial hegemony. Because Russia is leading the march toward gold-backed currency. And they have been hoarding gold, if you listen to Alasdair Macleod, since 1983. Even later, even more so, after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so has China. And we once had enormous quantities of gold. We still claim to have them. But if you go back and look, Dr. Ron Paul, when he was a congressman, asked to inspect our gold holdings. No one would allow him to do it. How much remains under the sidewalks in New York City is a damn good question. We haven't even talked about Fort Knox. And I know everybody thinks that place is chock full. Really? We ought to go see and find out. We're in a difficult position right now, Stephen. You know, this is why I said we're holding a weak hand. We're bluffing. The admiral is bluffing. Don't bluff. The Russians are not bluffing. They can do what they say. And we can't. And we shouldn't, because there's no reason to.
Just last night, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, Marco Rubio of Florida, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin said that it's time for the United States to lead out and start peace negotiations. It's going to require giving up land in order to get this done. Do you agree with that? I mean, I feel like Ukraine needs to start rebuilding their population while they still have men to repopulate the population. There's going to be nobody left. Ukraine will be completely decimated. Can there be a peace negotiation, and will it require Ukraine giving up land?
Anyone with a shred of humanity would say the things that they have said. They should have said those things 2 years ago. We've waited too long. I just received a note from someone who recently returned from Russia. And when you look at the disaster in Ukraine and the suffering and the misery there, it's unconscionable. This is our fault. It never needed to happen. Go back and look at the things that Putin said over the last 20 years. He repeatedly made it very clear what they would not tolerate, what they would not accept. Ukraine never needed to join NATO. Think of a better solution to U.S., NATO, and Russian security than a neutral Ukraine. That puts 500-600 miles between NATO's border and Russia. I thought that was a positive thing from the standpoint of the military. And instead, they want to drag it in. For what reason? So that they can threaten, bully, and potentially attack Russia. It's insane. It needs to end. Now, how do we do it? I don't think we can. With the current government in Washington, the duplicity, the deceit, the mountain of lies that everything has rested upon, why would the Russians trust us? Why would they believe anything we say? So you've got to, you really need a house cleaning in Washington, D.C. You need to drain the swamp. And I think Johnson, probably means well. So does Rubio and what's the other gentleman's name? I forgot.
Vance.
Yeah, J.D. Vance. But it's empty. It doesn't mean anything. Until you get rid of the people in Washington, and they're not all Democrats, okay? Until you get rid of these people, nothing will change. It will remain. So the question is, how much longer do people like Schultz, Macron, and others stay in office in Europe? That's the real question, because new faces in those countries with new governments are best positioned to approach Russia with an arrangement. But of course, the old Ukraine never made any sense. It consisted of all sorts of areas that were never historically Ukrainian. I mean, how many times do we have to go over this? And the same thing with population. There weren't even Ukrainians in most cases out in the East, and in Crimea, equally stupid. No one ever talks about the Crimean Tartars. This whole thing is completely ridiculous. We should not be involved in sorting out anything there. The Europeans are better positioned to do it. And how many times have borders changed in Europe over the last 1,000 years? Many, many times. And so have populations, and that is how peace has been made. We need to get out of it, stay out of it.
Well, I think, wasn't it George Washington that recommended stay out of foreign wars and only trade with people? That's how we'll build a great nation. And yet look at where most of our debt has come from, is foreign wars, spreading our military thin with foreign wars. So even all those many, many years ago, it seems that he had insight that most of us ignore, that is still applicable advice. In the remaining minutes that I have with you, Colonel, tell us about Our Country, Our Choice, and then I'll leave a link down below so that people can go learn more about it.
Okay. Our Country, Our Choice was founded last year by a group of people who pooled their monies with the goal of forming an organization that could be action-oriented. When I say action-oriented, they didn't want an organization that simply went out and held periodic rallies. They wanted an organization with a purpose. And we've only really been around now for almost 5 months. We're up to almost 250,000 members. So we've done very well. And why do people join? Well, first of all, people say all the time to me, because we talk about unifying Americans across party lines, they say, I voted Democrat or I voted Republican for years, and it didn't make any difference. Whatever I voted for never happened. In other words, I had no impact on policymaking. People have realized that they are not represented in Washington. So we're trying to build an organization that's designed not just to shape future policy and influence decisions that are made in Washington. We're trying to recruit people that can actually go to Washington and replace the people that are running the show. I say all the time, How much poison do you imbibe from a poison well before you finally say the stuff's making me sick? Why go back to the Ivy League schools that are filled with these people that have imbibed this sort of Marxism and cultural Bolshevism that teaches Americans to hate themselves, their country, their identity, to distance themselves from all the things that made us a great and powerful country. You mentioned Washington and Hamilton. They wanted to make America the engine of prosperity for the world. That's a good goal. That's where we were at our best, not invading other countries and exporting this thing they call democracy, which we've never been. We've always been a republic. And don't do that at bayonet point. It's failed miserably everywhere it's been tried. This is this nation-building fiasco, and this got started back in the 60s, as you know. We started this in Vietnam. The people that have done this to us need to be swept away. We need to focus on our country. We need to define ourselves once again. We haven't defined ourselves to the point now where people ask me all the time, Doug, you talk about the American people. Who are these people? And I said, well, I think they're out there. There are millions of us. We call ourselves Americans. We've been here for some period of time. We're the ones that have been fighting the battles for the country for hundreds of years, all right? We're here. We're there. We haven't vanished, but we have been beaten down. And we have no one representing our interests, and we have no one defining what it means to be an American. This is a very dangerous thing. And so we want our country, our choice, to be that mechanism, that instrument. And to do it, we've got to bring people from both political parties into the organization. And it has to be a nationalist organization. We are first and foremost about the United States. We're not paying lip service to it. We're serious. And all those troops that we now have sitting around in various expensive places in Eastern Europe, new bases, new airfields with extensive contract food, transportation, and medical support, we need to bring them home. We need to defend our country first and foremost in the Western Hemisphere. We need to put an end to the criminality in our cities. We need a restoration of the rule of law. Those are the things we need to do. And anybody who wants to join us in that, we're 100% happy to have you. You know, that's what we're about. Those are the things that matter to us.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate you taking the lead on that and getting the word out. I know you could just be enjoying your retirement, but you continue to fight for the United States, and I appreciate that. Colonel Macgregor, thank you for coming on. Thank you for your insight, your service to our country. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Same to you.